Okay, hi. My name is Erin, and I wanted to do my presentation on death and dying in the Philippines because that is where my boyfriend is from. So I like to learn more about the culture whenever I get a chance, either from talking to him directly or just looking some stuff up on my own. So for my sources, I did do a couple more than needed because I needed a little more than just two sources to get my info. So the first one is an article titled Burial Speaks, Understanding the Language of the Casket by a man named Edgar Eslett, and that was in 2013. And this was just from some additional info. I didn't need this article. And it was about differences between burial and death practices among various cultures, including things like how those differences are influenced by religion and things like that. He also mentioned how the death of a loved one is deeply mourned in Asian culture and elaborated on that a little bit more. And he also elaborated on different traditions related to death and dying, specifically in Japan, China, Indonesia, Korea, and the Philippines. My next source is a sociocultural exploration of the concepts of death and dying among Filipino children, and that was in 2020, so just last year. And this was a study done to understand children's understanding of death and dying by interviewing a sample of 8 kids with previous experiences of a death of a relative in the past 6 months of that time. Another one of my sources is Aging Filipino Siblings, Intermittent Preferences, Application of Conjoint Analysis, and that was in 2019. And this compared preferences for funeral-related things among these siblings who were in charge of the burials and all that kind of stuff for their deceased relative. And it compared things such as where they would like the place of the wake to be, how long they would want it, rituals, the type of burial they would they like an obituary or no obituary, and things like that. And then finally, the last source I have doesn't really relate to the rest of my info, but it was just something interesting that I found that I wanted to share. And it's about burials in anthropomorphic jars in the Philippines. And it was an archaeological study done in 2019. It was a study by Russian and Philippine archaeologists, and they uncovered anthropomorphic and zoomorphic burial jars in various caves in the Philippines, specifically on the island of Mindanao, which I thought was very interesting. So first, I will talk about Catholicism because, as in many places, of course, religion is a very big influence, and in the Philippines, that is mainly Catholic. And so there are plenty of Catholic people out there, especially in the Philippines, who know that they have no need to fear death because they know that they've been saved and they know that they are going to heaven if they've done the right things, followed the right doctrines throughout their life, and all that kind of stuff. And as well, in regards to Catholicism, suicide is considered killing because it goes against the fifth commandment, which says, "Thou shalt not murder." So people who die from suicide, unfortunately, are not usually given a traditional mass or burial because they committed suicide. So in regards to burials, funerals, memorial services, wakes, and all of that, there are of course many ceremonies that mark the Christian calendar, including rituals surrounding death, of course, such as funerals, and they are usually accompanied with village processions and music, which are both essential parts of Roman Catholic ritual practices. Some of these things include a 9-day novena with prayers and mass each night, and then on the 9th night, the very last night, the deceased has a chance to return and say goodbye during what's called an ateng, which is a food offering to ward off evil spirits. During this time, family members of the deceased person will usually wear black. They'll wear black if the deceased person is a family member, and oftentimes they will wear white if the deceased person is a child, which I think is interesting because I think here in the States we wear black no matter whether the deceased person is an adult or a child. And they may dress this way for an extended period of time and avoid parties and whatnot. And they will also honor their dead during certain holidays, such as October 31st. In the Philippines, October 31st, Halloween of course, is not celebrated the same way as in Western countries at all. It's very different. So some of the things that they'll do include children in rural villages going house to house asking for money in a form of traditional almsgiving, if you will. Families will also spend much of the evening visiting graves to show respect and honor to their deceased relatives, those who have recently passed away and those who have passed away in the past. They will do that by feasting and offering prayers, very similar to Dia de los Muertos in Mexican tradition, if you're familiar with that. And the observance of this holiday is more than just one night, including various preparations. Oftentimes it can last up to a week or more. And some of these preparations include thoroughly cleaning cemeteries and traveling back home to visit the graves of deceased relatives. So here on the screen, you can see a picture of a traditional cemetery in the Philippines, as well as some flowers with candles, which are both very common offerings for the deceased during this time. There are also some superstitions related to death and dying, specifically at funerals and wakes and things like that. Such as sneezing at a wake can mean that you risk dying. Another one is that while the casket is being loaded into a vehicle, relatives are encouraged to pass under the casket, because that can help them move on with their lives. Another one is that you shouldn't let your tears fall on the coffin, or else the deceased person will have a difficult journey into the afterlife, which of course you would want it to be as smooth and peaceful as possible. And another one is that you're not supposed to sweep or clean during this time, or you could encounter more death in the family, so waste would be picked up by hand, for example. Lastly, I wanted to talk about something I just found interesting, which are these jar burials. So like I briefly mentioned when I was talking about my sources, there were many archaeological excavations done on the island of Mindanao, which is one of the 3 main islands of the Philippines. The article mentions previous projects in the 60s as well as some more recent ones. And these excavations were done in several caves along the island. And, the archaeologists found clay vessels and soft stone urns with remains of buried people, and some of them had more than one person buried in them. And of special interest to these people were the anthropomorphic and zoomorphic urns, the ones that were shaped like humans or animals. And some aspects of these jars included various emotions shown on the faces, because some of the jars had head-shaped lids that actually had some facial characteristics to them. And the jars also had sexual characteristics to them to specify male or female of the deceased person inside of them. And so these jars served as funerary containers, of course, but also provided specific information about the people buried in them, which I thought was really interesting. Alright, so here are my citations. Like I said, I used a couple extra just to get some extra info and get the rest of what I needed, and I also included the citations for my pictures and whatnot. Thank you so much for listening.